The first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was an email. I was 34 years old, sitting at my desk in a quiet corner office I'd earned after 10 steady years in the same manufacturing company, when the subject line appeared on my screen. Family meeting. Mandatory. No greeting, no warmth. Just those 2 words, followed by my father's name, Harold Collins. I stared at it longer than I should have. My parents rarely used the word mandatory with me anymore. That had been reserved for childhood, curfews, church, family dinners where my opinions were politely ignored. I clicked it open. We'll be discussing the future of Collins Tool and Die. Attendance expected. Sunday, 4 p.m. Dinner provided. That was it. No mention of me specifically. No context. No explanation. Collins Tool and Die was the family business. My grandfather, Walter Collins, had started it in the 1960s with 1 lathe and a rented garage. By the time I was born, it had grown into a mid-sized operation, supplying parts to regional construction firms. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, profitable, and deeply tied to our family identity. I had worked there since I was 22, not as a favor, not as a placeholder. I'd earned my MBA at night while working days on the floor, then moved into operations. I streamlined inventory, renegotiated vendor contracts, took on compliance when no one else wanted it. By 30, I was director of operations. People outside the family answered to me. Inside the family, things were different. I had an older brother, Mark, 38, charismatic, restless. He'd worked at the company briefly in his 20s, then left to find himself. Real estate, a failed startup, a consulting stint that ended quietly. He always came back for holidays with big ideas and no follow-through. My parents adored him. Mark was the visionary. I was the reliable one. That dynamic had been set so early, I barely noticed it anymore. Still, the email bothered me. I replied with a simple, "I'll be there," and went back to work. Or tried to. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Numbers blurred. Conversations replayed in my head. Family meeting. The future of the company. Sunday came faster than I expected. My parents' house hadn't changed in 20 years. Same colonial exterior. Same oak dining table where decisions were announced. Not discussed. Announced. When I arrived, Mark's car was already there. New. Expensive. He was leaning against it, phone to his ear, laughing. "Big day," he said when he saw me, slipping the phone into his pocket. "You ready?" "For what?" I asked. He smiled, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "You'll see." Inside, the table was set formally. My mother, Diane, fussed with place settings. My father sat at the head, papers neatly stacked in front of him. I noticed something immediately. There were folders, thick ones, 1 in front of each chair, except mine. Dinner was tense but polite. My mother talked about the neighbor's new kitchen. My father asked Mark about a project he was considering. No one asked about my work. They rarely did. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. "Let's get started," he said, tapping the table lightly. He slid a folder toward Mark, then another toward himself, then one toward my mother. Finally, he looked at me. "We'll explain as we go." I felt something tighten in my chest. I didn't interrupt. I waited. That was my role. "As you know," my father began, "your mother and I have been thinking about succession." Succession. The word echoed. "We're not getting any younger," my mother added, smiling tightly. "And the company needs fresh energy." Mark nodded, solemn. "I've been ready for this for a while." I kept my face neutral. My father opened his folder. "We've decided to restructure ownership, effective immediately." Immediately. I glanced down at the table again. Still no folder. "Mark will be stepping in as CEO," my father continued. "We've already filed the paperwork." The room seemed to tilt slightly. CEO. "Congratulations," I said automatically. The word tasted strange. "And you," my mother said, finally looking at me directly, "will be transitioning out of your current role." "Transitioning out? To what?" I asked. My father folded his hands. "We think it's best if you take a severance package and explore other opportunities." Explore other opportunities. I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. "I run operations," I said calmly. The company depends on that. We've considered that, my father replied. Mark will be bringing in his own team. I looked at my brother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. When does this take effect? I asked. Tomorrow, my father said. Tomorrow. I nodded once. My heart was beating hard, but my voice stayed steady. May I see the documents? My father hesitated, then slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Not a folder. 1 page. Severance agreement. Non-compete clause. Waiver of claims. You've already signed this, my father said. I looked up slowly. I have not? Yes, you have, my mother said gently. When you renewed your employment agreement last year, I felt cold. That was an HR update, I said. Standard. It included consent for restructuring, my father replied. Legal reviewed it. I read the page carefully. My signature was there. I recognized it. I also recognized the day my grandmother died. Walter Collins' widow. The woman who had quietly owned 40% of the company until her passing. The woman who had always told me, you keep things running. Don't let them forget that. My hands were steady as I placed the paper back on the table. I see, I said. No one spoke. I stood up, smoothing my jacket. Thank you for dinner. My mother frowned. That's it? For now, I replied. As I walked to the door, my father called after me. This is what's best for the family. I didn't turn around. I drove home in silence, the streetlights blurring past, one thought repeating in my mind. They didn't just remove me from my job. They planned it. And whatever I had signed that day, grieving and distracted, was only the beginning. Because if they thought I would leave quietly, they had misunderstood me completely. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner in slow motion. My father's calm voice, my mother's practiced smile, Mark's refusal to look at me. Every detail felt deliberate, rehearsed. This hadn't been a family conversation. It had been an execution. By morning, the shock had settled into something colder. Focus. I went to work, anyway. Old habit. Muscle memory. Collins Tool and Die had been my second home for over a decade. I knew the rhythm of the place better than my own. The smell of oil and metal, the hum of machines warming up, the way supervisors leaned into my office doorframe when something was wrong. I parked in my usual spot, walked in with my badge. No one stopped me. Yet. I sat at my desk and pulled up my employment file. HR records, contracts, amendments. I searched by date. There it was. Employment agreement update. Signed. The timestamp hit me harder than I expected. 2 years ago, November 14th, the day after my grandmother's funeral. I remembered that week clearly. The numbness, the exhaustion. My mother insisting I come into the office to stay busy. HR asking me to sign a stack of routine updates. I hadn't read them closely. I trusted the company. I trusted my family. I opened the document. Buried on page 7 was the clause my father referenced. Consent to restructuring. Waiver of executive claim. Mandatory arbitration. Non-compete radius so broad, it effectively erased my career in the industry. I sat very still. This wasn't sloppy. It wasn't opportunistic. It was patient. At 9:30, my assistant, Claire, knocked softly on the door. You okay? She asked. People are saying things. What things? I asked. That Mark's back. That there's an announcement coming. I nodded. Has anyone told you I'm leaving? Her eyes widened. No. Good, I said. Neither has anyone told me officially. She hesitated. Do you want me to start backing up files? Yes, I said immediately. Everything I'm legally allowed to access. She didn't ask questions. Claire had been with me long enough to recognize tone. At 10, an email went out company-wide. Effective immediately, Mark Collins assumes the role of Chief Executive Officer. We thank Emily Collins for her years of service and wish her the best in her future endeavors. Years of service. No farewell. No acknowledgement of what I'd built. People started coming by my office in ones and twos. Awkward smiles. Quiet apologies. No one knew what to say. They'd been told a story, and I wasn't invited to correct it. Mark didn't come to see me. Instead, his new assistant appeared just after lunch. Mark would like you to clear out by 5, she said, eyes fixed on her clipboard. Security will escort you. I looked at her calmly. I'll be gone before then. She nodded and left, relieved. I spent the afternoon doing one thing: reading. Contracts, board minutes, ownership records. Anything I'd ever been copied on but never needed to scrutinize before. Patterns began to emerge. Quiet shifts. Minor votes taken when I was traveling. Decisions framed as temporary. And one name kept appearing: Elliot Crane, external counsel, family attorney. The man who had overseen my grandmother's estate. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. We didn't want it to go like this. I didn't reply. At 4:30, I packed my things. Personal items only. Photos, books, the mug Claire had given me when I made director. I left everything else. As I walked out, the plant manager caught up to me. This is wrong, he said quietly. Everyone knows it. I met his eyes. Wrong doesn't stop people. Paperwork does. He nodded slowly, as if committing that to memory. Outside, the air felt sharper, like I'd stepped into a different life. I drove home and poured a glass of water I didn't drink. Then, I opened my laptop again. I searched for Elliot Crane. His firm specialized in estate planning and corporate transitions. He'd been my parents' lawyer for decades. He'd also drafted my grandmother's will. I pulled up the probate records. Something didn't line up. The ownership transfer after her death had been accelerated, consolidated into a family trust faster than usual. The trust beneficiaries listed my parents, not me. That was odd. My grandmother had always been clear about one thing. She believed in balance. She believed everyone should have a stake. I remembered her voice, low and certain, the last time we spoke alone. They'll try to keep things neat, she'd said. You pay attention. I hadn't understood then. Now, I did. At 7 p.m., my mother called. I wish you'd stayed, she said softly. I was dismissed, I replied. For your own good, she said. This way, there's no conflict. No, I said. This way, there's control. She sighed. You're overthinking. I'm finally thinking, I replied. Silence stretched. Don't do anything rash, she said. I almost laughed. I won't, I said calmly. I'll do everything properly. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote 3 names on a piece of paper. Elliot Crane, Susan Patel, Michael Hargreave. Susan Patel was a corporate litigator I'd met years earlier at a compliance conference. Michael Hargreave was a forensic accountant who specialized in family businesses tearing themselves apart quietly. I didn't need revenge. Not yet. I needed clarity. And for the first time since Sunday night, I felt something steady under the shock. They had moved first. Now it was my turn. And whatever I'd unknowingly signed 2 years ago, I was done signing anything blindly ever again. Because the moment you realize love was used as leverage, you stop confusing silence with peace, and you start preparing. By Tuesday morning, the anger had sharpened into something more useful: precision. I met Susan Patel for coffee in a quiet place downtown, the kind of cafe where people spoke softly and mind their own business. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, as I walked her through the last 10 years of my life, in facts, not feelings. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. This wasn't sudden, she said. It was staged. That's what it felt like, I replied. She nodded. Family businesses rarely explode. They corrode. I slid copies of the documents across the table. The employment agreement, the severance, the board minutes I'd found. She skimmed them quickly. The non-compete is aggressive, she said, but not airtight. More importantly, this clause you signed doesn't remove ownership rights. I looked up. What ownership rights? She tapped the page. Your grandmother's shares. My stomach tightened. Those were folded into the trust. Yes, Susan said. But that trust was supposed to distribute ownership evenly among heirs. Which didn't happen, I said. Exactly, she replied. And unless you signed a separate waiver of inheritance, you still have a claim. I leaned back slowly. No one had ever told me I owned anything. Not my parents, not Mark, not Elliot Crane. Susan continued. Your parents consolidated control by accelerating probate and restructuring the trust. That's legal only if all beneficiaries consent. I didn't, I said. And you were never asked, she finished. That's a problem. For them. I left the cafe an hour later with a list of next steps and a sense that something important had just shifted. That afternoon, I met Michael Hargreave in his office. He was older than I expected, silver-haired, with the quiet demeanor of someone who had seen too much money ruin too many families. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, and requested full access to company financials from the last 15 years. "They'll fight disclosure," he said. "I know," I replied. "That tells me there's something to find," he said simply. When I got home, I found a package waiting at my door from my mother. Inside were my childhood things: photos, old report cards, a framed picture of my grandmother and me standing in front of the factory when I was 16. No note. Just objects. It felt like a gesture or a warning. That evening, Mark emailed, "We should talk before lawyers get involved." I didn't respond. The next day, Susan filed a formal request for trust documentation and ownership records. Certified. Documented. Calm. Within hours, my father called. His voice was controlled, but tight. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I'm entitled to information," I said. "You're entitled to severance," he replied. "We've been generous." "You've been strategic," I said. He exhaled. "You don't understand how fragile this is." "I understand exactly how fragile it is," I replied. "That's why you're afraid." Silence. "You're jeopardizing Mark," he said. "I'm not responsible for protecting him," I replied. "You made sure of that." He hung up. By Friday, Susan received the first batch of documents. Not everything. Just enough to satisfy the request without revealing too much. But it was enough. Michael called me that night. "There's an inconsistency," he said. "Where?" I asked. "In how dividends were distributed after your grandmother's death," he said. "Payments shifted entirely to the trust, then to your parents. But internal memos reference you as a passive beneficiary." "Passive?" I repeated. "Meaning you were expected not to act," he said. That assumption underpinned everything. I closed my eyes. They had counted on my silence, built around it, planned for it. Michael continued. "There are also payments labeled consulting fees that don't align with any services rendered." "Mark?" I asked. "Mark," he confirmed. The pieces began to align. The failed ventures, the new car, the ease with which you stepped into the CEO role. This wasn't just about removing me. It was about funding him. That weekend, my parents hosted a small gathering. I wasn't invited. I heard about it through Claire, who texted me quietly. "They're telling people you wanted to leave, that you were burned out." I stared at the message. Burned out. Another convenient narrative. On Sunday night, I drove past the factory. Lights were on. Late shift running. People working the systems I'd put in place, processes I'd built. I sat in my car and watched for a long time. I wasn't sentimental. I wasn't nostalgic. I was observant. And I realized something then, sitting in the dark. They had removed me from the building, but they hadn't removed me from the structure. Not legally, not financially, not yet. And once you see where leverage actually lives, you stop chasing fairness. You start reclaiming position. I turned the car around and drove home, already drafting the next email in my head. Because the moment they believed I was gone, they began to expose what they'd hidden. And I intended to let them. The trust documents arrived the following Wednesday. Not all at once. Not cleanly. They came in pieces, released in careful increments like someone rationing oxygen. Susan forwarded them to me as they came in, each email more revealing than the last. By the time the final packet arrived, I had already stopped being surprised. I printed everything and spread it across my dining table, turning my apartment into a quiet war room. Page after page. Amendments, addendums, footnotes that carried more weight than the body text. The original trust, created by my grandfather Walter Collins, was simple, clear. 40% of company shares placed into a family trust to be distributed equally between grandchildren upon the death of the surviving spouse. My grandmother, Evelyn Collins, had added one amendment 5 years before she died, a safeguard. If one beneficiary was actively employed in the company and another was not, voting rights would be temporarily adjusted to maintain operational stability, but ownership would remain unchanged. Ownership would remain unchanged. That line was underlined in her handwriting. After her death, my parents acted quickly. The trust was restructured, voting rights were consolidated, dividends redirected. And then, quietly, Another amendment appeared, dated 3 weeks after the funeral. It bore my father's signature as trustee and mine, or something meant to resemble it. I stared at the page until my eyes ached. It wasn't my signature. Close, but not mine. The slant was wrong, the pressure uneven. Anyone who knew me well would see it instantly. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic. Certainty. I called Susan. That signature isn't mine, I said. I was hoping you'd say that, she replied. Because neither is the notary stamp valid. What? I asked. The notary was inactive at the time, she said. License expired 6 months earlier. I closed my eyes slowly. Forgery. Not a misunderstanding. Not manipulation. Forgery. They crossed a line, Susan continued. A clear one. Michael called an hour later. I found the money trail, he said. Dividends meant for trust beneficiaries were routed through a shell LLC before landing in Mark's accounts. When did that start? I asked. Right after the amendment, he replied. The forged one. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't about favoritism anymore. This was about fraud. That night, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't told her where I lived, which meant she'd asked someone, or followed me before. She stood in the hallway, purse clutched tightly, eyes scanning the space behind me. You're tearing this family apart, she said. I didn't forge anything, I replied. She flinched, just slightly. Your father did what he thought was necessary, she said. Mark needed help. And I didn't? I asked. You were always fine, she replied. You didn't need us. There it was again. The story they'd told themselves for years. I need you to leave, I said. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed firm. If you pursue this, there will be consequences. For who? I asked. For all of us, she said. I stepped aside, gesturing to the door. Then you should have thought about that sooner. She hesitated, searching my face for something familiar. The daughter who would soften, the one who would compromise. She didn't find her. After she left, I locked the door and sat down on the floor, the papers still spread across the table. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. The next morning, Susan filed a motion to compel full disclosure and preserve records. At the same time, Michael quietly contacted a federal forensic examiner he trusted. Once we involve them, he warned, there's no going back. I'm not interested in going back, I said. By Friday, Mark called. His voice was tight, brittle. What are you doing? I'm reading, I replied. You're blowing this out of proportion, he snapped. Dad handled the paperwork. That's the problem, I said. He handled it illegally. Silence. You knew, I said calmly. I didn't want to, he replied. There's a difference. There isn't, I said. He hung up. That evening, I received a notification from Susan. They've requested mediation. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I replied, not yet, because mediation was about compromise, and they hadn't earned that. Not after stealing my position. Not after forging my name. Not after building their future on the assumption that I would stay quiet. I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker on. The truth was out now. Documented. Verified. And once truth exists outside a family's control, it stops being a private matter. They had tried to manage me out of the story. Instead, they'd written me into the center of it, and the next move would decide everything. They asked for mediation the same way they had always asked for compliance. Politely. Urgently. As if the tone alone should convince me. Susan forwarded the request with a single line beneath. They're worried now. That told me everything. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because timing mattered. People reveal more when they think they're losing control. In the meantime, Michael kept working. The forensic examiner he brought in was methodical and quiet. The kind of professional who didn't dramatize findings because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. By the end of the week, we had a preliminary report. The forged amendment wasn't an isolated incident. There were 3 separate documents bearing my name that I had never signed, each tied to a key shift in ownership, dividend allocation, or voting rights. Each notarized by the same inactive license. Pattern. Intent. Michael summarized it simply. This wasn't desperation. This was planning. I believed him. On Thursday morning, my father's lawyer called Susan directly. They're prepared to settle, he said. Privately. Susan put the call on speaker so I could hear. They'd like to avoid escalation, he continued. This is a family matter. Susan's voice was calm. Forgery and financial misrepresentation are not family matters. A pause. What would your client accept? He asked. Susan glanced at me. Full restoration of ownership, she said. Public correction of company records, and acknowledgement of misconduct. Another pause. Longer this time. That's not realistic, the lawyer replied. Susan smiled slightly. I could hear it in her voice. Neither is pretending this didn't happen. That afternoon, my mother called again. Her voice was softer now, measured. Can we talk? She asked. Just the two of us. No, I said. Emily, she said, using my name the way she did when she wanted something. Please, I'm asking as your mother. I closed my eyes briefly. That's not leverage anymore. She inhaled sharply. You're punishing us. I'm protecting myself, I replied. You don't have to destroy everything, she said. I thought about the word destroy. How often it was used to describe exposure instead of wrongdoing. I didn't break this, I said. I found it. Silence followed. Then a quiet, desperate shift in tone. What do you want us to say? She asked. That was the moment. Not what they did wrong, not how to fix it. What do you want us to say? I want the truth, I said. On record. That will humiliate your father, she replied. He signed my name, I said. He humiliated himself. She started crying then. Real tears this time. I could hear them. But I didn't move toward them. I had cried alone long enough for both of us. I need you to understand something, I said quietly. I didn't choose this path. You did. Every time you decided I didn't need to know, every time you assumed I wouldn't look, she hung up without another word. That night, I received a message from Claire. Mark held an all-hands meeting today. He said you left because you wanted to start something new. He told everyone to respect your privacy. I stared at the screen, still managing the narrative, still controlling the story. I forwarded the message to Susan. Her reply came quickly. Good. That makes the correction more powerful. By the following Monday, the federal examiner finalized his report. Susan read it carefully, then looked up at me. This crosses into criminal territory, she said. Once this is filed, it won't stay in civil court. I nodded. I understand. Are you prepared for what that means? She asked. For them? I didn't answer right away. I thought about my grandmother's voice, about the factory floor, about how often I've been told to be reasonable, to let things go, to keep the peace. I've been reasonable my entire life, I said. This is just the first time I'm being honest. Susan filed the report that afternoon. No announcement, no warning, just paperwork moving from one office to another. That evening, Mark showed up at my door. His face was pale, his confidence gone. You went too far, he said. No, I replied. You did. You don't understand what you've done, he insisted. They could lose everything. I looked at him steadily. They risked everything when they decided I didn't matter. He swallowed. What about me? I considered him. The brother I'd covered for, protected, enabled by staying silent. You'll finally find out what's yours, I said, and what never was. He stood there a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it, not in relief, but in resolve. The line had been crossed, not by me, by them. And once the truth is filed, stamped, and dated, it no longer belongs to a family. It belongs to the record. And the record was about to speak. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, not to me, to the company. I heard about it from Susan before anyone else could spin it. Federal inquiry, she said. Request for documents, communications, and internal approvals related to trust restructuring and dividend allocation. I closed my eyes, not in fear, but recognition. This was the moment where everything stopped being theoretical. Once regulators ask questions, narratives lose their power. Only records remain. By noon, my phone was lighting up. Numbers I hadn't heard from in years. Former board members, a retired accountant, even a distant cousin who worked in insurance compliance. I didn't answer any of them. At 2 p.m., Mark called. His voice was different now. Not angry, not defensive, afraid. They're asking for emails, he said. Old ones. Yes, I replied. They're going back years. Yes, I said, again. You could stop this, he said. You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. I leaned back in my chair. It stopped being a misunderstanding when Dad forged my name. He exhaled sharply. You're really going to let this destroy the company? I'm letting the truth determine what survives, I replied. He didn't answer, just ended the call. That afternoon, Susan forwarded me a memo that had been circulated internally at Collins Tool & Die. Subject: Document Retention Protocol. Immediate compliance required. It was written in careful language, but the urgency was obvious. Employees were being instructed not to delete anything, not to discuss the inquiry externally, not to speculate. Fear travels fast in organizations. By Wednesday, the board convened an emergency session. I wasn't invited. That would have hurt once. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. Michael called later that night. They're scrambling, he said, trying to reconstruct justifications retroactively. That won't work, I replied. No, he agreed, because the timestamps don't lie. On Thursday, Susan received notice that Elliot Crane had retained separate counsel. That's interesting, she said. He's distancing himself. From who? I asked. Your father, she replied. And Mark. I thought of Elliot Crane, the man who had smiled politely at every holiday, who had shaken my hand at my grandmother's funeral, the man who had notarized documents with an expired license. The next letter arrived Friday morning. This one was addressed to my parents personally. I didn't see it, but my mother called me within the hour. Her voice was shaking. Not performative this time. Raw. They're accusing your father of crimes, she said. I stayed quiet. He doesn't understand, she continued. He thought he was doing what was best. He understood enough to hide it, I said. You don't have to do this, she whispered. I didn't, I replied. I asked for documents. Silence. They're asking about the trust amendment, she said finally. I know, I replied. And about the signatures. Yes, she began to cry then. Deep, gasping sobs that carried years of denial with them. We gave you everything, she said. I thought about the years I paid my own tuition, the promotions I earned without their advocacy, the way my role had been erased overnight. No, I said softly. You took everything and called it protection. She hung up. That weekend, the company website went dark. Not entirely. Just the About Us page. The one that listed family leadership. Photos removed. Bios edited down to vague language. Interim management announced. Mark's title was no longer CEO. I found out through the trade newsletter. Resigned, the article said. Pending review. I read it once, then closed the browser. This wasn't about him anymore. On Monday, Susan called with a tone I hadn't heard before. Your father's attorney wants to talk, she said. I waited. They're asking for a global resolution, she continued. Civil settlement, ownership restructuring, public correction. And criminal? I asked. That's not theirs to control anymore, she replied. I nodded. Do you want to hear their proposal? She asked. Yes, I said, but I won't negotiate. She understood. That afternoon, the proposal arrived. Full restoration of my ownership stake. Back dividends with interest. Public filing correcting trust records and acknowledging unauthorized amendments. And a clause requesting my cooperation in demonstrating lack of malicious intent. I laughed. Once. Susan didn't. They want you to save them, she said. I won't lie for them, I replied. That may be the deal breaker, she said. Then let it break, I replied. That night, I stood on my balcony and watched the city settle into itself. Lights flickering on, lives moving forward. I felt strangely calm. For the first time since Sunday dinner weeks ago, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. They had spent years managing me out of the picture, quietly. Now the record was speaking loudly, and it wasn't asking anyone to be reasonable. It was asking them to answer. The next chapter wouldn't be decided at a table. It would be decided on paper. And paper, I had learned, remembers everything. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in a downtown law office I'd never been to before. Neutral ground, glass walls, a long table polished to a shine that reflected faces too clearly for comfort. Susan arrived with me, calm and unreadable. Michael joined by phone. Across the table sat my parents, Mark, and 3 attorneys who all looked like they had slept very little. No one offered coffee. No one smiled. This wasn't mediation. It was containment. My father spoke first. We're prepared to correct the record, he said, voice steady but thin. Restore ownership. Issue public statements. Make this right. I watched him carefully. The man who had run a company for decades, who believed authority came from certainty, now choosing his words like stepping stones. Susan nodded once. We've reviewed the proposal. And? My mother asked quickly. And it's incomplete, Susan replied. Mark leaned forward. What more do you want? I answered before Susan could. I want to stop being managed, I said. The room went still. This isn't about money anymore, I continued. It's about accountability. My father's jaw tightened. We're offering accountability. No, I said. You're offering correction without consequence. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Criminal exposure is outside the scope of this discussion. Exactly, I said. And that's why I won't cooperate in minimizing it. My mother's eyes filled again. You're punishing us. I met her gaze. I'm refusing to protect you. Mark slammed his hand lightly on the table. You're enjoying this. I turned to him slowly. If I were enjoying it, I would have done this years ago. He looked away. Susan slid a document across the table. Here are our terms. They read in silence. Restoration of ownership was there. Back dividends. Public correction. Removal of my father and Mark from any fiduciary role. An independent board appointment. And one final clause. No request for cooperation, beyond truthful testimony if required. My father looked up. This could ruin us. I nodded. That risk already exists. You don't have to push it, he said. You could help us show this was confusion, poor judgment. I won't rewrite the truth to make it easier to swallow, I replied. The attorneys whispered urgently among themselves. One of them turned to me. You understand that if this proceeds, it may not end well for your family. I leaned back in my chair. I understand that it already didn't. Silence settled again. Then something unexpected happened. My father spoke without looking at anyone. I forged her signature, he said. The words landed softly. No drama, no denial left to hide behind. My mother gasped. Mark stared at the table. I told myself it was temporary, my father continued. That I'd fix it later. That it was for the business. He finally looked at me. I didn't think you'd ever see it. I held his gaze. You counted on that. He nodded once. No one spoke for a long moment. Susan broke the silence. Thank you for your honesty. That will be reflected. One of the attorneys closed his folder slowly, like he was sealing something. This changes our advice, he said to my parents. I know, my father replied. The meeting ended shortly after. No agreement signed, no hands shaken. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for me. I stepped back. I need you to understand something, I said quietly. This isn't revenge. It's boundaries. She nodded, tears falling freely now. I know, she said. I just wish it hadn't come to this. So do I replied. And I meant it. Outside, Susan let out a long breath. You handled that, she said. I didn't handle it, I replied. I stopped absorbing it. That afternoon, news broke in the industry press. Collins Tool and Die, under federal review, following internal governance issues. No names yet, no details. But it was enough. I went home and sat in the quiet of my apartment, letting the weight of it all settle. I wasn't celebrating. I was grieving something I'd never really had. A family that could separate love from control. A workplace where contribution mattered more than blood. But grief didn't mean retreat. That evening, Michael called with an update. The independent board is already discussing restructuring, he said. Your ownership stake gives you leverage. Good, I replied. What do you want to do with it? He asked. I looked out at the city lights again, steady and indifferent. I want transparency, I said. And then I want out. He paused. Out? Yes, I said. I don't want to run what they broke. That was the realization. Taking back control didn't mean staying. It meant choosing what came next. And for the first time since that email marked mandatory appeared on my screen, the future felt like something I could define, not as a daughter, not as a placeholder, but as myself. The record was still speaking, and the next thing it would say would change everything. Once the truth was spoken out loud, everything accelerated. Not emotionally, administratively. The independent board was appointed within 10 days. 3 outsiders, no family ties, no patience for history. They asked for data, not explanations, reports, not reassurance. Michael briefed them. Susan attended every meeting. I listened more than I spoke. That alone unsettled people. For years, I had been the one translating complexity into comfort, making problems smaller so others didn't have to feel them. Now, I let the numbers sit where they landed. They were heavy. The forensic report was entered into record. The forged amendments were officially invalidated. Ownership reverted to the original structure as my grandmother had intended. 40% of the company trust assets were redistributed. Half of that was mine. I didn't react when Susan told me. I wrote the number down on a yellow legal pad, then closed it. Money wasn't the point anymore. Control was. My father and Mark were placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. Title suspended. Access restricted. Decisions routed through interim management. It was quiet. No shouting. No dramatic exits. Just doors that no longer opened when they expected them to. My mother stopped calling. Instead, she sent messages through Susan's office. Questions about logistics, about what would happen to the house, to retirement accounts, to the life she had assumed was secure. I didn't respond. One afternoon, Mark showed up again. This time, he didn't knock. He just stood in the hallway when I opened the door, shoulders slumped, hands empty. I didn't know it would go this far, he said. I studied him carefully. The brother I had covered for since childhood. The one who took and took without ever asking where it came from. It only feels far because you've never been on this side of consequence, I replied. He nodded, swallowing hard. They're talking about selling. The company? I asked. No, he said. The house. I felt something shift then. Not pity, recognition. That house had been the center of gravity for our family. The place where decisions were announced, where silence was enforced, where I'd learned to keep my voice measured. Selling it felt like an ending. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for how I treated you. I waited. For letting them do it, he added. I nodded once. That's the part that mattered. He looked at me, eyes red. Is there any way back? I thought about it. Really thought. Not to what it was, I said. And not soon. He accepted that. Or maybe he didn't have the energy to argue. As he turned to leave, he asked one last question. What are you going to do? I answered honestly. I'm leaving. He blinked. Leaving what? All of it, I said. The company, the fight, the role you all wrote for me. He looked stunned. But you won. I shook my head. I reclaimed my agency. That's different. That night, I drafted a proposal. Not a threat, not an ultimatum, a plan. I would sell my ownership stake back to the company under strict conditions. Independent valuation, transparency clauses, a requirement that the board implement governance reforms permanently. No family member in a fiduciary role for a minimum of 10 years. Susan reviewed it and raised an eyebrow. You're giving up control. I never wanted control, I replied. I wanted choice. The board reviewed my proposal the following week. They didn't argue. They accepted. The exit was clean, professional, irreversible. When the transfer was finalized, I felt something lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. Not responsibility, expectation. The assumption that I would stay and fix what others broke. I sent one final message to the board. I appreciate the opportunity to restore what mattered. I'm choosing to move forward. No bitterness, no blame, just clarity. On my last day as a stakeholder, I visited the factory one final time, not to say goodbye, to observe. New systems were already being implemented. New leadership asking questions instead of issuing orders. The place felt different, less like a family heirloom, more like a business. That was as it should be. As I walked out, the plant manager stopped me. They should have listened to you years ago, he said. I met his eyes. They heard me. They just didn't want to answer. Outside, the air felt lighter. I got into my car and didn't look back. Because walking away wasn't defeat. It was the final decision they never thought I'd make. And once you realize you don't have to stay to prove your worth, everything else becomes possible. The quiet didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through ordinary moments. A morning without emails from lawyers. An afternoon where my phone stayed silent. A night where I slept through, without waking to replay conversations that were already over. For weeks, my life had been structured around reaction, responding, reviewing, preparing. Now there was nothing left to respond to. That unsettled me more than the chaos ever had. I took a short-term lease in a different part of the city, closer to the river. Smaller place, fewer reminders. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't need to. The version of me they tracked through logistics no longer existed. On my first morning there, I stood at the window with a cup of coffee and watched joggers pass by, faces focused on their own private goals. No one cared who my father was. No one knew my last name carried weight somewhere else. It was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Susan called midweek, not with urgency, but closure. "Everything's finalized," she said. "Your exit is complete. Funds transferred, governance changes recorded." "Thank you," I replied. She hesitated. "You did something most people don't." "What's that?" I asked. "You stopped once you had power," she said. "Most people keep going." I thought about that after we hung up. Power had never been the goal. That was the mistake everyone made when trying to understand me. They thought I wanted to replace my father, outmaneuver my brother, take the throne. I didn't want their seat. I wanted my life back. The calls from extended family came in waves. Some cautious, some intrusive, a few openly judgmental. I didn't answer most of them. When I did, I kept it brief. "Yes, everything is resolved. No, I'm not discussing details. I'm doing well, thank you." I could feel people recalibrating, trying to figure out which version of the story to believe. The one where I was difficult, or the one where things had been hidden for years. I let them sit with the discomfort. That Thanksgiving, I didn't go home. Instead, I spent it with two friends I'd known since grad school. One divorced, one recently widowed. Women who understood what it meant to rebuild something after it collapsed quietly. We cooked together, talked about nothing important, laughed at the wrong moments, ate too much pie. At one point, one of them asked, "Do you miss it?" I knew what she meant. "The idea," I said, "not the reality." That was the truth. In December, I received a letter from my mother, handwritten, careful, no return address. She wrote about the house being sold, about downsizing, about how strange it felt not to host Christmas anymore. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She wrote, "I hope one day you'll understand why we did what we did." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Understanding wasn't the same as agreeing, and it wasn't my responsibility to offer absolution in exchange for peace. Mark reached out once more before the end of the year. He sounded tired, older. "I'm starting over," he said, "consulting. Smaller scale." "I hope it works," I replied. There was a pause. "I should have protected you." I didn't rush to comfort him. "You should have questioned them." "Yes," he said quietly. We left it there. The new year arrived without ceremony. No resolution to announce. No victory lap. Just days that belonged to me again. I took a contract role with a logistics firm as an independent advisor. Short-term, flexible. The work was interesting. But more importantly, it didn't consume me. For the first time, my identity wasn't tied to proving my value. One afternoon, while organizing old files on my laptop, I came across a scanned photo I hadn't looked at in years. My grandmother and me, standing in front of the factory gates. I was 20, proud, certain I was building something permanent. She had been smiling, but her eyes held something else. Caution. Awareness. She'd known the difference between legacy and control. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. That was when I realized the storm hadn't just changed my circumstances. It had recalibrated my instincts. I no longer rushed to fill silence. I no longer softened truths to make others comfortable. I no longer mistook endurance for loyalty. Those were losses, yes, but they were also gains. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. The kind that gives you space to hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time. I didn't know yet what the final chapter of this story would look like, but I knew this much. It wouldn't be written around anyone else's expectations, and that made all the difference. I didn't announce the next phase of my life to anyone. There was no email, no update, no carefully worded explanation to soften the shift. I simply started living differently. And let that be enough. The consulting role turned into something steadier than I expected. A mid-sized logistics firm brought me on to untangle operational bottlenecks they'd ignored for years. The work was familiar, but the dynamic was not. I wasn't someone's daughter. I wasn't the reliable fixer in the background. I was hired for my judgment, and my authority came from contract, not history. That mattered more than I realized. On my first day, the CEO shook my hand and said, "If you see something broken, say it. We don't do politics here." I almost laughed. I said it anyway. Over the next few months, I watched a version of myself emerge that had been quietly waiting. I spoke without rehearsing. I disagreed without apologizing. I made decisions without imagining how they would be received at a dinner table I no longer sat at. Nothing dramatic happened. Things simply worked better. That was the strange part. When you stop compensating for dysfunction, competence becomes visible. People listen. Systems improve. The world doesn't collapse when you refuse to be managed by guilt. In March, Susan called to check in. "Any regrets?" she asked. I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "But I see things more clearly now." "Like what?" "That being needed isn't the same as being valued," I replied. She was quiet for a moment. That lesson usually costs people more. I knew what she meant. Around the same time, I ran into someone unexpected. Elliot Crane. It happened at a professional networking event I almost skipped. I was refilling a glass of water when I heard my name spoken carefully behind me. "Emily." I turned. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller, the confidence gone. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said. "I didn't," I replied calmly. He nodded, accepting that. "I wanted to tell you I'm no longer practicing." I said nothing. "They revoked my license," he continued. "The notary violations were indefensible." "I know," I said. "I should have refused," he said quietly. "I should have told you." "Yes," I agreed. He looked at me like he wanted absolution. I didn't offer it. "I hope you're well," he said finally. "I am," I replied, and meant it. I walked away without another word. That interaction stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because of anger, but because of what it clarified. Everyone involved had told themselves a story that justified their choices. They had believed the consequences would never reach them. They were wrong. By summer, my days had settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Work that challenged me without consuming me. Evenings that belonged to me. Weekends that didn't revolve around obligation. I started saying no without explanation. I declined invitations that felt performative. I accepted ones that felt grounding. I traveled alone, ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired. Small choices, radical impact. My parents didn't reach out again. That absence was no longer loud. It didn't ache the way it once had. It simply existed, like a scar that had healed cleanly. Once, in July, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother's number. Just a photo. The factory sign being removed. No caption. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put the phone down. That chapter was closed. Not erased. Closed. I understood something then that had taken me decades to learn. Some families don't teach you how to belong. They teach you how to endure. And endurance, left unchecked, can look like love. But it isn't. Love doesn't require silence. It doesn't demand compliance. It doesn't punish clarity. The life I was building now didn't ask me to disappear in order to be accepted. It asked me to show up as I was, and that was something I was finally willing to do. The storm had passed. The damage was visible. The repairs were mine to decide, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for permission to begin again. I already had. By early fall, the story had stopped following me. That was how I knew it was truly over. No more whispered updates from former colleagues. No more curious pauses when someone recognized my last name. The company I'd helped build was now just another entry in an industry database, its history quietly revised by new leadership and governance policies that would never mention why they were necessary. I liked it that way. I moved again, this time by choice rather than necessity. A smaller place, closer to the lake, with wide windows and clean lines. Nothing inherited, nothing heavy. Every object in it was something I'd chosen, paid for, and placed exactly where I wanted it. That mattered more than I would have admitted a year ago. One Saturday morning, while unpacking the last box, I found an old notebook I hadn't seen in years. Notes from my MBA classes. Margin scribbles about process optimization and leadership theory. On the inside cover, written in my own handwriting, was a sentence I'd forgotten. Competence without authority becomes exhaustion. I sat on the floor and let that settle. I had lived that truth long before I understood it. In October, the logistics firm offered me a permanent role, senior advisory position, clear boundaries, no expectation of loyalty beyond performance. I took it, not because I needed stability, but because I wanted alignment. Work that respected the fact that I had a life outside of it. Leadership that didn't confuse sacrifice with commitment. The day I signed the contract, I didn't tell anyone in my family. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their pride. The absence of those things no longer felt like a loss. It felt like space. Mark reached out once more around that time, an email this time, carefully worded, measured. He wrote about therapy, about how becoming accountable was harder than he expected, about how much he'd taken for granted. I read it twice. Then I replied with a single paragraph. I'm glad you're doing the work. I'm not ready to rebuild anything. That may change, or it may not. Either way, I wish you clarity. He didn't write back. I was okay with that. Some relationships don't end with anger. They end with understanding, arriving too late to matter. Thanksgiving came quietly again. I hosted 2 friends and their kids. We cooked, talked, cleaned up together. No seating arrangements, no politics disguised as tradition. At one point, one of the kids asked what I did for work. I help companies fix things, I said. Like a boss? He asked. I smiled. Like someone who knows where the cracks are. That night, after everyone left, I stood by the window and watched the city lights reflect off the water. I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd tried to balance fairness and stability in a family that valued control more than trust. She hadn't been wrong to try, but she had underestimated how far people will go when they believe silence is guaranteed. I understood now that my silence had been part of the system. Not because I wanted it to be, but because it made things easier for everyone else. Breaking that silence hadn't made me powerful. It had made me visible. And visibility, I'd learned, was enough. The following week, I received one final piece of mail, forwarded from my old address. A holiday card from my parents. Generic, no handwriting inside. Just their names printed neatly at the bottom. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it in the recycling bin. Not out of anger, out of honesty. I had kept what mattered. My integrity, my autonomy, my ability to choose relationships that didn't require me to disappear. I had left behind what didn't. Control, obligation, a version of family that only worked when I stayed quiet. That was the trade, and I would make it again, without hesitation. Because the life I was living now wasn't louder, it was truer. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the real inheritance. The final chapter wasn't about what they lost. It was about what I refused to lose ever again, myself. The end didn't arrive with an announcement. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology, no moment where everything suddenly made sense for everyone involved. Life rarely gives you that kind of symmetry. Instead, the ending came quietly, the way real endings usually do, disguised as an ordinary day. It was a Tuesday morning in December. I was walking along the lake before work, the air sharp and clean, when my phone buzzed with a notification from a news alert I'd forgotten I was still subscribed to. Local manufacturer finalizes sale to private equity group. I stopped walking. I didn't open the article right away. I already knew what it would say. That Collins Tool and Die, the company my grandfather had built, the one my parents had controlled and nearly destroyed trying to control me, had been sold. Leadership restructured. Legacy language softened. History reduced to a paragraph. I read it anyway. Mark's name wasn't mentioned. My father's wasn't either. The company no longer belonged to any of us. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the water move steadily toward a horizon that didn't care about family drama, betrayal, or revenge. The lake didn't remember who had owned what. It didn't take sides. It just kept going. And for the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. Later that week, Susan called one last time. Not as my lawyer, but as someone who had seen the whole thing from the inside. "It's officially done," she said. "No loose ends." "Thank you," I replied, "for all of it." "You were unusually disciplined," she said. "Most people want vindication. You wanted closure." I thought about that after we hung up. Vindication requires an audience. Closure only requires honesty. I didn't attend Christmas anywhere that year. No obligation dinners, no balancing acts. I stayed home, cooked something simple, and video called a friend who lived 3 time zones away. We talked about books, not families. About plans, not grievances. At some point, she asked, "Do you think they regret it?" I considered the question carefully. "I think they regret losing control," I said. "I don't think they regret using it." She nodded slowly. She understood more than she said. That night, I pulled out the old notebook again, the one with the sentence about competence and exhaustion. On the last blank page, I wrote something new. I will never trade my autonomy for belonging. It wasn't a vow made in anger. It was a boundary drawn in clarity. The truth is, this story isn't about revenge, even though it might look like one from the outside. No one ended up in handcuffs. No courtroom scene played out dramatically. No one begged. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. I stopped protecting people who harmed me. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from my confusion. I stopped confusing family with access. And when I did that, the power dynamic collapsed on its own. If you're listening to this and you're still waiting for someone to choose you back, hear this clearly. Sometimes the betrayal isn't what they take. It's what they assume you'll tolerate. The moment you stop tolerating it, everything changes. You don't need to scream. You don't need to punish. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to decide. Decide what you will no longer sign. Decide what stories you will no longer carry. Decide whose comfort you will stop prioritizing over your own dignity. I didn't destroy my family. I removed myself from a system that required my silence to function. And in doing that, I chose something better than revenge. I chose myself. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like it, share it, or leave a comment. I read them all. And if you want more stories about family drama, betrayal, quiet payback, and the kind of justice that doesn't fade, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't a confrontation. It's walking away with your boundaries intact and your future finally your own.